Awake before me, mortals! You are in the presence of Thor, Lord of the Acer! This deck is awful. How did this actually get a top 32 cut at YCS Toronto in 2011, I believe? I've never read a Nordic card in my life. That's not true. But I can say that I've never played Nordic in my life.
This is one of my biggest pet peeves in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And this example right here is what I would define as the Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Scoff. If my example wasn't already clear, I would define the Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Scoff as the idea of saying a deck or deck concept is bad without ever testing or trying it yourself. And to be honest, this even goes a bit further than just not testing a deck. It even goes as far as people just blatantly disregarding the results of a specific deck or player using a deck just by saying that the deck they're playing is bad arbitrarily. This brings me to one of my main points of the video, which is oftentimes a deck's strength is defined completely arbitrarily. A lot of times if you go back and replay formats, especially in the Time Wizard format era, a lot of people just define what was good by what the historical meta is without actually thinking about what made a deck good at that time. I feel like people tend to forget that most events take place for a single format over the course of like a couple months before a new set comes out and completely redefines and changes what is meta at that given time. So in other words, there's not a lot of time for people to actually play and fully explore a format, and you only get to see that deep dive look when you go back and replay that format in Time Wizard events. And I think this is what confuses me the most about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Scoff, which is that people typically define what a meta of a previous format was just by looking at what topped in that very short window of time, and they oftentimes ignore some of the more niche tops, like those decks aren't actually good. Like you'll see that with Nordic, people don't recognize Nordic as a powerful deck. Kar Curry has seen some recent recognition in Tengu Plant format as a strong deck, but initially it wasn't really recognized as one of those bigger, stronger decks of the format, which to me is just really confusing because in my opinion, for them to get here, to get to this point, to get a top out of YCS, they had to have been at least somewhat strong. And this also opens up the question of maybe there are other decks that weren't actually played that could be strong, and that's where we'll talk about what makes a deck strong or what makes a deck actually top in any given format. So let's first break down what makes a deck or deck type good, or even reasonably speaking able to top. First, the deck itself has to be piloted by a good player. The player piloting must be at a skill level to compete with the other top players in the tournament. To even take it a step further, that player must also choose to work on and test that rogue strategy over the other popular decks in the format. This is a difficult expectation to have of a player because once again, players only have a couple of months in a given format to fully test and develop their decks before a new set is released and warps the meta. This time crunch is obviously solved with the likes of Time Wizard formats, which is why I feel the potential of a lot of past formats hasn't been fully reached. That being said, those players also must develop a deep understanding of their deck and therefore be able to play their deck perfectly in tournament. They have to power through the common meta as well as the relative meta of that tournament. Oftentimes you see certain influxes of decks or deck types at different tournaments based on the flavor of the month. Lastly, not only do they have to top with the deck as likely one of, if not the only players piloting the build, but they are expected to do this multiple times. In other words, if multiple people begin topping with it, then it's considered viable more so than if a single person does. This, in my opinion, is the current logic people use, but in reality, it holds no logical ground. Not only does this deck have to see success multiple times, but the number of times it sees success is completely random. Like, there's no given rule of how many times a deck has to top before it's considered good. These are the non-spoken rules that Yu-Gi-Oh! Players have typically established to determine whether a deck is viable or good. And if you look at this criteria, you can see how unlikely and near impossible it is for someone to achieve just because of the raw numbers behind it. If there's only one person piloting the deck and they have to pilot it in every event and top with it multiple times to maybe prove that their deck is good, then that doesn't actually make any ground with the community. The reality is that deck has to be popular by other players. If you see 10 people playing Tengu Plants in a tournament and 5 of them top, that doesn't necessarily mean Tengu Plants is just the best deck of the format. It just means 10 people played Tengu Plants and 5 of them made it through. So to put this differently, if 5 people were to play Nordics in a tournament, tournament, there's a very good chance that Nordics could top versus if a single player did, especially if those players are talented or at the skill level required to top with the deck. And this is something I want to dive a bit deeper on. As someone who has actually made an entire library for a format, I have definitely taken the time to play and test out a lot of the decks that have topped YCSs, especially unique ones. In the case of Nordic, if you guys watched my reaction video to Simo playing Nordics, you know that I roasted him because he played the deck completely incorrectly and then was going on saying that the deck was bad. And then we even had Dave Trepanier, who actually topped with Nordics, come into the comments and say that I actually understood what he was going for with the deck and understood the lines of Nordics, which he was surprised by because not a lot of people did at that time. So this is something that I wanted to talk about, which is when you're creating a deck or when you're creating a library or trying to play a deck, a lot of times you really have to try to get in the head of the player that created the deck. You have to understand why they did it. I can't tell you how many times I would open up a deck that topped a YCS and I would look at it and be like, this deck just does not look good, and I completely did not understand what made it function. And it wasn't until I tested that deck extensively that I fully understood why that deck was actually strong. And then you start seeing the lines that those players were going for, and then you understand that that deck is actually way stronger than you initially thought because of the fact that you just need to take the time to learn it. And that's something that a lot of people need to understand about people playing decks at events, is more times than not in these periods of time where people top a YCS, no matter what deck they topped with, they put a ton of time, extensive time testing their deck versus the meta to see and make sure that it was a worthwhile deck to take to a larger event. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, and something to kind of keep an open mind on is there are a lot of decks that can be very strong, but it just requires you to put the extra effort in to see and understand why they're strong. And if you don't actually test the deck, you're not going to know, which is why this whole Yu-Gi-Oh! Scoff concept really bothers me, because I feel like a lot of people just write off decks without actually testing them or fully understanding what makes them good. And I want to further support this point by talking about Amazing Mike Man. He's been consistently playing Jurax in the Tengu Plant Discord, and he ended up taking 3rd and 1st place in tournaments with the deck, constantly trying to improve it over time so he could see success. And as he did it, he still saw a lot of backlash from the community of people saying that the deck wasn't that strong or wasn't that good, and just getting written off for no clear reason when he is clearly seeing success with it. I'd oftentimes hear arguments of people saying that, oh, he didn't play enough against enough meta decks, which I would check what he played against, and I'd find that to be untrue, or that, you know, the players he was going against weren't that good or something like that. There's always some excuse or reason why people felt like his deck wasn't that strong, which to me is very confusing, because again, when you're seeing success with it, it has to be somewhat strong for that deck to function. Otherwise, it would not be able to top. If it was strictly just worse than everything else, it would have a very difficult time winning against the meta, which is just completely untrue based on what you can see from his tournament results. Now let's take this a step further and talk about Heroes, which was a deck that actually saw almost no success historically in Tengu Plant format. It doesn't really have any historical tops during this time, and yet is being regarded as one of the best, if not the best deck in Tengu Plant format right now, because of its raw strength. And the only thing that defined it is a lot of people are seeing success with it and playing with it in the Tengu Plant Discord, for example, and yet for some reason we can define Heroes as being a strong competitive deck, but when Jurax sees success, it's troll, or it's not considered as good, which again just doesn't make any sense. But if you actually break down what the strengths of a deck like Jurax are, as seen in Amazing Mike Man's guide on the deck, you can see that the deck has consistency, powerful late game payoffs through the likes of Rekindling, easy Trish combos, and every Jurak gets another Jurak, and especially in the case of Tengu Plant format, the card like Jurak Velo can trade with all 3 of your opponent's Tengus and then get you a Guaiba, which is very, very strong. One of my main goals of doing this video to begin with is to try to adjust or change the culture of Yu-Gi-Oh! Players in the way they think. Instead of looking at a deck at face and just saying, no way could that deck be strong, I really would like people to try to change their mentality to think, in what ways is that deck strong? Or how could this deck be strong? Because in reality, there's a lot of ways certain decks actually can work, and sometimes you have to completely change or rework how you view that deck or how you approach building that deck for that deck to actually see the success you want. I've even received a lot of criticism on my videos that involve like my tier list, for example, because I put a lot of decks in either tier 1 or tier 1.5 because I basically believe in the strength of it. And my tier list is always based on the idea of what can win a tournament or what could win a tournament but maybe is a little more difficult, and then what probably can't win a tournament. That's basically how I base it, because in reality that's how you should base it. That's how you should define if a deck is good. If it can win a tournament, then that deck should be viewed as a good deck, in my opinion. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that the deck is bad if it could win a tournament against meta decks, right? So that's usually how I base it, and I get a ton of flack for people saying like that I put ranked decks way too high, or no way could a deck be that good, and so on and so forth. But in reality, I feel like this is the most logical way to approach it. Again, there is no hard rule or hard definition of what makes a deck good or bad, so you really should look at it from a very open perspective of what could be good or what could be bad. In other words, we should adjust the culture of this mentality and take the scientific approach of not speaking in absolutes. We shouldn't take decks at face. We should consider that our perspective or understanding of a deck could be or is wrong. This enables you to start seeing the potential in certain strategies and begin to innovate and expand into new or more refined metas. At the end of the day, that's what expanding on an unpopular archetype is. It's innovation. Innovators are not chained down by existing concepts, which means that you are truly open to seeing the potential of an idea more so than adopting the common black and white mentality many people have. I can't tell you how many events I've entered with unique builds that people have looked at and told me are bad, and then I proceed to win with them. I also think it's worth mentioning that this really only applies in metas where the format is actually diverse. For example, Tengu Plant format being the most diverse format in history, it's gonna have a lot of options in terms of what can be played because the meta isn't very oppressive. But if you were to try innovating a ton in the likes of Dragon Ruler format, you probably would see less success because of just how oppressive Dragon Ruler and spellbooks were by comparison to literally everything else. Ultimately, the goal of this video is just to encourage you guys to have more of an open mind in what is playable or strong or even competitive in comparison to what you're typically told. Because like I said, I feel like a lot of people are very keen to put decks down for no real reason. There's usually not a lot of backing. It's what I would encourage you guys to do is, instead of taking what people say as word, just look at what they say and ask a lot of questions, right? If someone says X deck is bad, then you should ask, well, why is it bad? And if someone says X deck is good, you should also say, well, why is it good? I feel like more times than not, a lot of times people will formulate their own individual beliefs or opinions based on very baseless claims. They don't actually have a lot of facts or experiences to back up what they're saying, which is why sometimes you'll see people bandwagon things that aren't actually as good as others. This line of thinking is really important because one thing that I've noticed in regards to the Tengu Plant Discord even is we have a list of decks that we've deemed competitive, but there's no reason why they're more competitive than other decks. As an example here, Himne won with Scraps, but we have Scraps located in Rogue and not competitive, even though it has literally won a tournament. And in my opinion, what would define a deck as competitive would be what can win a tournament or what can top a tournament. And if we want to go a step further, we can talk about Psychics. I won a tournament with Psychics, and very recently Shinuslaw took third place with Psychics, and yet we refuse to accept that this deck is strong. In fact, a lot of people give backlash saying that this deck is weak or not very good, when I've seen nothing but success or seen other good players such as Shinuslaw playing the deck have success with it. So why is it not considered strong? It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And in reality, I just think whatever logic or reason we typically use to evaluate a deck's strength is usually completely arbitrary, and we should try to take a broader approach when looking at these decks, especially in such a diverse format like Tengu Plant format. One big key of advice I can give to players out there looking to innovate their strategies is take a look at a deck and think about how people commonly build it, and then consider if there is an alternative way you could build it to make the deck more functional. For example, with Ice Barriers, this was a deck that I discovered actually was a lot stronger than people gave it credit for, because many people were trying to use the tuner cards that didn't really accomplish very much in order to make the synchro monsters that kind of bait players into thinking that's what the strategy of Ice Barriers needed to be, when in reality the deck actually functioned way better as a tribute summon deck, similarly to Monarchs more so than a synchro or combo S deck. And when you consider that there are different ways to play a deck, or maybe different directions to go, you can sometimes solve the weaknesses of certain deck types. For example, if you are playing a deck that's weak to Max C, you might consider reducing the number of special summons or changing how that deck is piloted so you don't get hurt by Max C as much. If you take anything away from this video, it should be that you should do your own research in regards to deciding if a deck is good or bad. You should openly consider what makes this deck strong, or what makes this archetype potentially strong. What are its strengths? How can you improve those strengths? How can you take it further and push that deck to its limits? Because I don't think it's good for anyone to tell you that your deck is bad or that your ideas are bad. At the end of the day, there is always some merit to something you are doing. And while yes, there are some cases where some decks are just objectively weaker than others, in a lot of ways, and especially in diverse formats such as Tengu Plants, there are a lot of ways to make a deck stronger than people would ever initially believe. So don't let anyone crush your enthusiasm. Don't let anyone push down your ideas. Push yourself to your absolute limits, push your decks to their absolute limits, and have as much fun as possible. That's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and make sure you all have a great time doing today.